Drake Bell just went on Josh Peck's podcast, and Charlie Sheen's ex just made a chilling public statement. I'm about to tell you guys how that's connected and why this picture is so haunting.
It was the monster was there.
The Hollywood secrets that we're about to deep dive are so dark and disturbing that barely anybody is talking about this. Brian Peck, Drake Bell, Charlie Sheen, and Corey Haim. Names we've all heard, but the connection here is startling, you guys. These topics we're about to get into do get heavy, so in an effort for this information to no longer be suppressed, please engage and share with this if you can, and buckle up as we dive deep into Hollywood's darkest secrets. So first we'll start out in February of last year on the Boy Meets World's Cast podcast. On that episode last February, they mentioned a name that you've heard me speak about before. Brian Peck, who was a guest actor and crew member on the 90s sitcom Boy Meets World. Ryder Strong and Wilfred L. describe how Brian Peck managed to become very integrated into their personal lives as young kids. They recount Brian Peck's eagerness to be good pals with them, hanging out with them a lot after work, which they now describe as weird and wildly inappropriate. But of course, as young child actors, they didn't realize the grave seriousness of this at the time.
Kids are scared. You know, kids don't think I'm gonna go. First of all, for me, the person that was doing it to me the most, you know, well, I mean, I could say that the two people that did it to me were both close friends of mine. Or so I thought.
That was Corey Feldman, a child star from the 80s who was quoted saying that Brian Peck would invite him to his house to watch movies, and he'd go because he trusted him, but there was always a vibe like he was too close and too interested. Later in his 2020 documentary that's called My Truth, Corey Feldman again named Brian Peck, saying Brian Peck was one of those guys who was always around us kids. We didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, knowing what he did, it's clear he was part of that world.
Brian, who was ever present during the Amanda show. And then...
Well, that's another thing, too, you can kind of, like... It was, like, ever present, right? Like, just everywhere that... yeah.
It immediately becomes clear that Brian Peck's troubling time in Hollywood, orbiting around young boys, goes way farther back than just the Amanda show and Drake and Josh. This traces all the way back to the mid-'80s when he worked as a dialogue coach on the set of Growing Pains with a very young Leonardo DiCaprio.
Leo, as you know, is the latest, hottest, hunkiest teen idol there is.
Yeah, muscles.
Look, speaking of hunky, huh?
Leo, what's it like to be a teen idol?
Ask her Cameron.
Show us the little drawings.
Oh, the
You
little
see,
drawings.
we draw drawings of each other. Brian is the famous artist, and we always make fun of each other and portray each other in silly, satirical ways.
Leo's job on this set, for some reason, is to make fun of me all day long.
Okay, so
Brian Peck also worked on All That and The Amanda Show alongside Dan Schneider, which is where he began preying on Drake Bell. He was then later put back on a set with Amanda Bynes alongside Dan Schneider yet again in her show What I Like About You. But before that, he also worked on Good Burger and The Keenan and Kel Show with a very young Kel Mitchell and Kenan Thompson, who also starred on All That. And he was a dialogue coach on the set of Holes with a very young Shia LaBeouf. But now, since the documentary Quiet on Set aired last year, Brian Peck is best known for being convicted in 2004 for abuse of a Nickelodeon star who was later to be revealed as Drake Bell. Brian Peck systematically groomed Drake Bell, who was a very young teenager at the time.
As that big break between Drake and Josh and Amanda show is when I told my mom what was going on. We went to the police, the investigation, all of the stuff that you saw in the documentary. That was when all of that was going on.
A baffling and heartbreaking revelation that we found out from Drake is that even after he had confided in his mother and there was an investigation underway into Brian Peck was still allowed on Dan Schneider's set to do the pilot of Drake and Josh, even though that was the workplace of the very child who was accusing him.
And then we do the pilot, because he hadn't been arrested when we did the pilot.
And we're like 14.
Yeah, and so now I'm coming back. He hasn't been arrested, and I don't know if you remember, but he came and visited during the pilot, and I got him, and I made sure, and that was an issue, but I still had to play like, hey, cool, whatever, like,
wow.
You're about to get arrested, bro.
Yeah.
And as we know, Drake did eventually get his day in court to stare down his abuser, but the atmosphere was not what you would hope for.
When we went to court, his entire side of the courtroom was full of directors, producers, writers, actors. It was just mind-blowing. And I was just sent into like a state of shock when I walked into that courtroom.
Drake found himself in a courtroom of Hollywood industry professionals, co-workers, and even people he considered friends, who were sitting largely in support of a 40-year-old man who was admitting to essaying a child actor who was in his professional care. Some of these Hollywood industry professionals even going as far as writing a letter of support to the judge on behalf of Brian Peck.
Totally re-traumatizing to later get these letters, which I just got last year, and seeing, I mean, it was every letter I turned, it broke my heart when I would see the name at the end of the letter and go, what? I thought we were friends, and the way that they portrayed me in the letters,
which ultimately led to a reduced plea of 2 counts of the 11 charges and a sentencing of only 16 months in prison. But here's the kicker, you guys. Hollywood didn't even blink about this. Brian Peck kept friends, big ones like Charlie Sheen, and that's where all of this starts to get really weird. So upon this guy's release from prison, Hollywood promptly hires him back on the child scene to be on none other than the show Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, where he did voiceovers for 3 episodes before he got fired. He had once again strategically positioned himself with the help of industry allies to be on a major child production with 2 very young boys. During this time, registered S offenders were still allowed to work in Hollywood. It actually wasn't until the Child Protection Act of 2012 where children then had legal protection from working with offenders on the registry. And I know all of that is enough to make you guys sick, but this is where we really start to get into things. After Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Brian Peck picks up a few other sporadic gigs. He was part of Bedtime Stories and had a small role in Forever Strong, and somehow he was even hired as a dialogue coach on the family film Jack and the Beanstalk. And all of that led him to eventually securing a role from his good friend Charlie Sheen to be a stand-in and dialogue coach on the show Anger Management. This is all following Charlie Sheen's tumultuous, tiger blood-fueled departure from 2.5 Men, and after knowing that Brian Peck is on the registered list. Despite getting pushback from other people, it's said that Charlie Sheen secured Brian Peck's paid position. And how do we know that Charlie Sheen and Brian Peck were friends? Well, let's start with some behind-the-scene footage of them together on the set of Anger Management.
It's my brilliant co-star. It's Brian, my sometimes brilliant stand-in.
And even more recently, we can peruse their social media and see that this is Charlie Sheen and Brian Peck having leisure time together in Scotland. Here is Peck and Sheen in a photo together captioned, "I have some kick-ass friends, love you Charlie Sheen and the Peck." Here's Charlie Sheen reposting a message that says, "Back at work and hanging with the Woof and the Peck. Not a bad way to spend a Monday." Here's Charlie Sheen posting about the adventures of Peck and Sheen, saying, "Once again, MIT grant-sanctioned archaeologists Peck and Sheen rig battle gear for tonight's sortie on the Loch Ness. 2:34 a.m. in 2013. Here we have Charlie Sheen with his friend Brian Peck in another solo shot together. Greatest Dad Award, Charlie Sheen. And of course, Sheen and Peck on the set of Anger Management. The Charlie Sheen-Brian Peck friendship is further troubling due to the similarities and accusations brought against both men by former teen idols that they had worked with.